In a quiet suburban neighborhood in the United States, Margaret had spent the last 2 decades in a small, worn-down house that had once been alive with laughter and family. Now, in her late 70s, her days were filled with memories and silence. She lived alone, surrounded by faded photographs and time-worn furniture that echoed her past. Widowed for years, Margaret's hope had always been that her family would grow around her, creating a home bustling with children and warmth. Her son, Daniel, was her only child. She had raised him with love, teaching him kindness and resilience, dreaming he'd stay close as he built a family of his own. But life, Margaret knew, had a way of pulling people in unexpected directions. When Daniel married, Margaret welcomed his wife, Julia, hoping she'd found not only a daughter-in-law, but a new friend. For the first few years, they shared holidays, birthdays, and small daily moments that made her feel part of something bigger. But as time passed, Julia's attitude towards Margaret changed. She became increasingly distant, sometimes cold, and more often than not, she would subtly find ways to exclude Margaret from family gatherings. Daniel, trying to keep peace, usually took his wife's side, leaving his mother on the sidelines, hurt but unwilling to interfere. After Daniel's sudden death in a car accident, everything changed. In her grief, Margaret thought Julia and her grandchildren would stay close. She'd offered to help with the children, even suggesting they live together to support one another. But Julia had other plans. Within a few months, she moved, taking the children and leaving no forwarding address, disappearing from Margaret's life as if she had never been there. The shock of abandonment shook Margaret to her core. She struggled to understand how Julia could be so heartless, how her only family could vanish so cruelly. Her world narrowed to loneliness and regret. The once familiar neighborhood now felt empty, and her days blurred together in sorrow. She yearned to hold her grandchildren again, to have a place in their lives, but she found herself powerless, without any way to reach them. Yet, in her heart, a faint hope remained, a hope she hadn't dared to entertain in years. A memory of another child lost long ago began to creep back into her thoughts, a son she had placed for adoption in her youth. Margaret's days had settled into a routine of solitude and quiet, but deep inside, an ache simmered, a blend of sorrow for her lost family and the bitter sting of betrayal by Julia. The small, old-fashioned house she had once cherished felt like a prison. Each room held a memory, a ghostly remnant of Daniel's laughter, the children's footsteps, and the sound of life she once took for granted. Now, her only company was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the cold hum of appliances. As months wore on, Margaret began to question the choices she'd made. Was she somehow responsible for Julia's decision to cut her off so brutally? Should she have intervened more, tried harder to build a stronger bond? At night, when she lay awake in the darkness, the questions haunted her, mingling with dreams of her long-lost son. The thoughts were unbidden, a whisper from the past that she hadn't heard in decades. He would be a man by now, living a life she knew nothing about, but the memory of him as a baby was etched in her heart. Placing him for adoption had been the hardest decision of her life, one she had made only out of necessity. Though she had told herself that he was safe and loved somewhere, she had always wondered if he might one day try to find her. This sense of loss for her firstborn was now impossible to ignore, as if her mind was reaching for him, grasping at the chance of connection she'd never had with Julia. It felt foolish, though. How could she hope that a stranger, a son she hadn't seen in so many years, might reappear and fill the hollow place in her heart? Still, the thoughts persisted, an anchor of hope she hadn't felt since Daniel's passing. One morning, as she was sorting through old photo albums, the decision came to her with startling clarity. She needed to search for her son. It wasn't just the loneliness pushing her, it was the realization that she had a part of herself still left unexplored, a part that might hold the comfort she so desperately sought. Maybe he had questions too, a desire to understand his origins. Maybe he too was searching for her. The decision filled her with trepidation. She was an elderly woman with little knowledge of how to even begin finding him. Her resources were limited, and the energy it would take felt daunting. Yet, a spark of resolve kindled within her. For once, she would take a chance for herself, even if it meant facing more heartache. Margaret knew she couldn't do this alone. To find her long-lost son, she needed help navigating the complexities of adoption records, especially since she hadn't even spoken his name in years. Determined yet anxious, she reached out to her closest confidant, Linda, a friend she had known for decades and one of the few people who knew about her son's adoption. Linda was an upbeat woman with a warmth that had comforted Margaret through many of life's storms. When Margaret revealed her plan, Linda didn't hesitate. "Oh, Margaret, of course I'll help you," she said, holding her friend's hands tightly. "This might be the best decision you've made in a long time. You deserve family, real family." With Linda's support, Margaret found herself leaning into her decision with new confidence. They began by searching online for agencies and resources that specialized in adoption reunification, hoping to locate some of the missing pieces in Margaret's past. Linda was a natural researcher, and her optimistic attitude helped keep Margaret's spirits high as they sifted through unfamiliar forms and confusing instructions. Yet Margaret could sense an undercurrent of doubt within herself, a fear that resurfaced each time she imagined seeing her son again. What if he resented her for placing him for adoption? What if he didn't want to meet her? Linda noticed her friend's anxiety one afternoon and sat her down. "Margaret, you made a decision that you thought was best for him at the time," Linda reassured her. "He may not understand it at first, but he'll know it wasn't easy. And if he's anything like you, he'll have a heart big enough to forgive." These words helped calm Margaret, but as the search progressed, she found herself increasingly torn between anticipation and dread. The idea of finding her son, after so many years, was both a dream and a nightmare. Every step brought her closer to the truth, but also closer to an outcome she couldn't control. Her life had been defined by her sacrifices and her devotion to others, and now, finally reaching out for something she wanted, felt strange, even selfish. Days turned into weeks as they worked on the search together. Linda became more than just a friend. She was Margaret's anchor, her reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. Meanwhile, Margaret began to confront the complicated feelings she held toward Julia, wondering if perhaps she had overlooked the warning signs of her cruelty. Linda gently encouraged Margaret to release her resentment, urging her to focus on the future instead. With a fragile but growing sense of purpose, Margaret steeled herself for what lay ahead. The possibility of rejection loomed, but so did the hope of acceptance. Her relationship with Linda, stronger now than ever, helped her find courage she hadn't known she had. She was beginning to understand that seeking her son wasn't just about filling the silence. It was about reclaiming the parts of herself she had hidden away for too long. As Margaret and Linda dove deeper into the search, they encountered one obstacle after another. The adoption had taken place decades ago, in a time when records were primarily paper-based and laws around adoption confidentiality were even stricter than today. Most agencies they contacted responded with polite but firm refusals, citing privacy policies that seemed to shut every door they approached. Each rejection weighed heavily on Margaret, filling her with a deepening sense of hopelessness. She had expected this to be hard, but she hadn't anticipated just how many walls she would face in her quest for answers. Frustration simmered within her. She couldn't help but feel that once again her life was slipping out of her hands. Linda, noticing her friend's discouragement, suggested that they hire a professional investigator who specialized in adoption cases, but Margaret balked at the idea. Money was tight, and she feared pouring her limited savings into a search that might yield nothing. The choice left her torn between her financial security and the chance to connect with the son she'd never known. Despite these doubts, Linda remained persistent, gently urging her to keep pushing forward. She suggested that they might try reaching out to support groups online, where others in similar situations might share advice or guidance. Skeptical yet desperate for answers, Margaret agreed to give it a try. Linda helped her create an anonymous profile on a forum dedicated to adoption reunions, and together they crafted a post explaining Margaret's story and her desire to reconnect with her son. As Margaret watched Linda type out the words, she felt exposed and vulnerable, fearful that she was casting her hope into a void. Days passed with no response, and Margaret's hope began to waver. Her dreams of reunion started to feel like mere fantasies. But then, late one evening, a reply appeared on the forum. It was from a woman who had been adopted herself, and who now worked with an organization that helped people reunite with family members. She offered Margaret advice on next steps and suggested resources she hadn't yet explored. With this new lead, Margaret felt her resolve strengthen once again. However, each step required patience and emotional stamina she wasn't sure she had. Every delay, every unanswered message, and every new roadblock felt like a personal test. Linda's support remained unwavering, but Margaret began to question if she was strong enough to continue. In the midst of these struggles, Margaret's inner doubts began. She worried that even if she found her son, he might reject her, or worse, be completely uninterested in meeting her. Yet Linda reminded her to take each step one at a time, to breathe through the anxiety, and to trust that no matter what, she was doing the best she could. Margaret clung to this encouragement, finding comfort in Linda's words. One quiet evening, as Margaret sat alone in her living room, memories of her son's adoption day surfaced more vividly than they had in years. She could still recall the weight of the decision, the flood of emotions as she held him one last time before handing him over to a couple who promised a life of stability and love. At the time, she had convinced herself she was doing the right thing, sparing him from the hardships of her own life. But now, with Daniel gone and Julia having abandoned her, that old decision lingered painfully in her heart, casting shadows over her thoughts. Margaret wondered if she could endure this journey of searching and waiting any longer. She had reached the age where peace of mind should be her daily companion, yet she found herself caught in an exhausting emotional struggle. Each day, her mind and heart wavered between hope and despair. She questioned her strength to keep going, and the familiar whispers of self-doubt began to echo. What if he doesn't want to meet me? What if he's happy without me? Am I even worthy of finding him? But as she thought over her life, the sacrifices, the loneliness, and the recent losses, Margaret realized something profound. She deserved to know what had happened to the child she had carried, raised for a short time, and loved so deeply. This search wasn't just about filling the void left by Daniel's death. It was about finding closure and a sense of identity that she had denied herself for so many years. The decision crystallized in her heart that night. No matter how difficult it would be or what she might face, she couldn't turn back. Margaret resolved to continue, no longer for the faint hope of mending her loneliness, but for herself, for the peace she longed for after decades of wondering and waiting. She understood now that this journey was part of her, a chapter she could no longer leave unwritten. The next day, she shared her resolve with Linda, who saw the renewed determination in her friend's eyes. With Linda's support, Margaret took the first concrete step toward her goal. She hired a professional investigator. Though the cost was daunting, she accepted that this was an investment not just in a potential reunion, but in her own sense of peace and healing. As the investigator began his work, Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt that she was reclaiming her life, her choices, and her story. Whether her son would want to see her or not, she was ready to face the truth, no matter where it led. Days turned into weeks as Margaret waited for news from the investigator, each passing day filled with anticipation and anxiety. Every phone call, every envelope in her mailbox made her heart race, hoping it held the information she'd been yearning for. The quiet house seemed to amplify the tension, filling the empty spaces with a silence that felt heavier than ever before. Margaret's routine revolved around waiting, and as the days stretched, doubts crept back into her mind. She had taken a leap, placed her hopes and her fears into this search. But what if it led to nothing? One afternoon, the investigator finally called. His voice was steady, and Margaret clutched the phone, bracing herself. "Margaret," he began gently, "I've managed to find a few leads on your son. His name was changed after the adoption, and he grew up a couple of states away." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. This was her son, the boy she'd imagined all these years. But now he was a man with a new name, a new life, one she knew nothing about. "It seems he's currently living in California," the investigator continued. "He's married with 2 young children of his own." Hearing that her son had a family stirred a surge of emotions in Margaret. He was no longer the baby she remembered. He was a father now, with responsibilities, with a life she hadn't been part of. The investigator's next words, however, hit her the hardest. "I can reach out to him, but understand that this may be a shock to him. He may not want contact." Margaret thanked him, ending the call with her hands shaking. She had imagined this moment countless times, but reality felt heavier, far more complex. The thought of disrupting his life, of reintroducing herself after so many years, now felt daunting, even selfish. What if she brought him pain? What if her sudden presence dredged up emotions he'd buried, or worse, created conflicts in his own family? Yet, the longing to know him, to see his face, was overwhelming. That night she couldn't sleep, her mind filled with questions she couldn't answer. She wrestled with the fear of rejection, the idea that he might view her as a stranger intruding on his life. But she also felt the undeniable pull to connect, to explain, to share with him the truth of who she was and why she'd made her choice so many years ago. In the end, Margaret resolved to give her son a choice. She instructed the investigator to reach out with a letter, something gentle and respectful that wouldn't pressure him, but would allow him to decide if he wanted to meet her. This would be her way of opening a door without forcing it open. The next morning, she sent a message to the investigator with her decision, along with a brief letter that poured her heart onto the page, explaining everything she had held inside for so long. As she sent it off, Margaret felt the weight lift, knowing that she had taken the only step she could without disrupting his life. She had done her part. Now, all she could do was wait, caught between hope and fear, trusting that whatever happened next, she was ready to face it. Margaret's days settled into a new pattern of anxious waiting, each moment filled with the uncertainty of how, or if, her son would respond. Every time the phone rang or a letter arrived, her heart leaped, only to sink when it wasn't the news she was waiting for. Linda continued to stand by her side, checking in daily and urging her to stay hopeful. But even Linda could sense the toll that waiting was taking on her friend. Then, one quiet afternoon, Margaret received an unexpected call, not from her son, but from the investigator. "Margaret, I have some news," he said, his voice measured and calm. "Your son received your letter, and while he needs time to process, he asked me to share something with you." Margaret's hands trembled as she held the phone, each word sinking in with the weight of a lifetime. She felt like the ground was shifting beneath her. The investigator continued, He mentioned that he always knew he was adopted. His adoptive parents had been open with him, and he grew up curious but uncertain about finding his birth mother. Hearing this felt like a revelation to Margaret. All these years she had believed she was entirely erased from his life, yet here he was, knowing of her existence, perhaps even wondering about her as she had wondered about him. The investigator added, "He said that after reading your letter, he finally felt a part of his past was being answered. He wants to know more, Margaret. He's interested in learning about you, about your story." This changed everything. The realization that her son had already thought of her, that he had carried his own questions and his own longing, lifted an incredible weight from Margaret's heart. She had always feared that reaching out to him might feel like an intrusion, a disruption in his life, but knowing he was open to knowing her felt like a gift. The years of guilt, of wondering if she had abandoned him in a way he could never understand, began to ease. Her son hadn't seen her as a stranger, nor did he seem to hold resentment. This revelation filled Margaret with a new perspective on her journey. She realized that her search hadn't only been for him, it had been a search for a part of herself, a part she'd hidden away, thinking she had no right to yearn for it. Now, with her son's openness, Margaret's perspective shifted from fear to gratitude. She felt a surge of courage, a sense of relief that her reaching out had been welcomed, not rejected. Linda's face lit up with joy as Margaret shared the news. "See," Linda said with a knowing smile, "he's been wondering about you too. There's a place in his life for you, Margaret, just as you had a place in your heart for him." Margaret nodded, absorbing this truth. From that day on, Margaret embraced the journey not as one of hoping to fill a void, but of reconnecting with a long-lost part of her soul. Whatever happened next, she felt ready to face it with peace and anticipation, no longer fearing the answers she might find. Days after receiving the news that her son wanted to know more about her, Margaret found herself filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The years of loneliness, guilt, and sorrow felt lighter now, replaced by a delicate but growing hope. She spent her days writing, recording her life's journey on paper, her childhood, the moments that defined her, and the story of her decision to place him for adoption. Each word seemed to bring her closer to him, a way to share her heart and give him a piece of herself. One evening, as she sat with Linda, a message came from the investigator. Margaret's son, whom she now knew was named Michael, had reached out to the investigator with a tentative invitation. He wanted to speak with her on the phone. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the words. A phone call. It was more than she had ever hoped for so soon. This first small step toward connection felt monumental, a doorway to the relationship she'd dreamed of, but feared would never come to be. Linda took her hands, steadying her as Margaret processed the moment. "You've been given a second chance, Margaret, a chance to know him, to be a part of his life in whatever way he allows. Don't worry about saying the perfect thing. Just be yourself." With a deep breath, Margaret agreed to the call. They set a time, and the following evening she sat by the phone, her heart pounding. When it finally rang, she answered, her voice soft and tentative. "Hello?" A voice on the other end replied, equally cautious. "Hi, this is Michael." The sound of his voice touched something deep within her, as though all the years between them had melted in that single moment. "Michael," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you for reaching out." There was a pause, filled with the kind of tension only a mother and her long-lost son could feel. But gradually, the silence was replaced by the gentle beginnings of conversation. They spoke carefully at first, each sensing the other's nerves, but as the minutes passed, the warmth between them grew. Margaret shared small memories, stories of her life, and her reasons for the choice she had made so long ago. Michael listened quietly, absorbing her words, occasionally adding a thoughtful question or sharing a bit about his own life. He was, as she discovered, a teacher, devoted to his family, and filled with a kindness that touched her deeply. When they finally said goodbye, Margaret's heart felt full. The conversation had been simple, yet the connection was profound. She realized now that Michael was indeed open to knowing her, that he didn't harbor resentment. Their talk hadn't been long, but it had been enough to rekindle her hope for a meaningful relationship. After the call, Margaret sat in silence, feeling the weight of years lift from her shoulders. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps this journey would bring not only answers, but also an unexpected happiness she had thought was beyond her reach. She was no longer alone in her longing. Her son, too, had a place for her in his life, and that knowledge gave her hope for a new beginning. After the phone call with Michael, Margaret's days felt brighter. A new energy filled her as she anticipated what this connection might grow into. She shared every detail of their conversation with Linda, who rejoiced in Margaret's happiness. But just as Margaret began to envision a future with Michael, unforeseen complications arose. A week after their conversation, Margaret received a message from Michael expressing concerns about his adoptive parents. They had recently learned of his contact with Margaret, and they were not happy. Michael's parents, who had raised him with love and care, felt hurt by his decision to reach out to his bi. For years, they had feared that meeting his biological family would diminish his bond with them, even though they'd always tried to be supportive. Now, faced with the reality of his search, they struggled with feelings of betrayal and insecurity. Michael shared his dilemma with Margaret, torn between his loyalty to his adoptive parents and his newfound connection to her. "I want to get to know you," he wrote, "but I'm also worried about hurting them. They've been everything to me, and I never want them to feel like I'm replacing them." Reading his words, Margaret felt a pang of guilt and sadness. She had never intended to cause any rift or conflict in his life. All she wanted was a place in his world, however small. The last thing she wanted was for him to feel divided, caught in an emotional tug-of-war between his adoptive parents and herself. The realization hurt deeply. Could she really ask him to continue, knowing it might hurt the people who had cared for him? Margaret wrestled with the decision. Her heart ached for Michael, who had finally found her, yet now faced the difficult task of balancing two families. Linda, seeing Margaret's distress, offered comforting advice. "Let him take his time, Margaret. Maybe reassure him that there's no pressure, that you'll understand if he needs to protect his relationship with his parents." So, with a heavy heart, Margaret wrote a message to Michael, expressing her support for whatever choice he made. "I never want to add stress to your life, Michael," she wrote gently. "If you need to pause things with me or move slowly, please know I understand. My door will always be open, no matter what." Her words came from a place of love, but sending the message left her feeling empty. She realized she might have to step back, even if it meant she'd never know the son she had dreamed of. The fear of losing him a second time felt unbearable, but she also knew that his happiness had to come first. As the days passed, she waited, uncertain if Michael would reach out again, or if he'd ultimately decide to protect his adoptive parents' feelings by leaving her in the past. Margaret faced a profound sense of loss and loneliness, as though she had been given a taste of joy, only to have it slip from her grasp. Margaret's heart was heavy with the thought that she might lose Michael just as he'd entered her life. She felt isolated in her pain, caught between her own desire to connect and her respect for Michael's loyalty to his adoptive parents. But in her darkest moments, Linda once again became her anchor, encouraging Margaret not to give up hope. Sensing Margaret's need for broader support, Linda suggested that she join a local support group for birth parents seeking reconnection. At first, Margaret resisted, hesitant to share her personal story with strangers. But Linda gently insisted, reassuring her that others in the group might have faced similar struggles and could provide the strength and guidance she needed. With Linda by her side, Margaret attended her first meeting. The group was small but welcoming, made up of people with stories much like her own, people who had loved, lost, and sought reconnection across years and distances. As Margaret listened to the others speak, she felt an unexpected kinship, a sense of being understood in a way she hadn't felt in years. Here were others who understood the unique pain of missing a child they'd had to give up, and the challenges of navigating complex family dynamics. In one meeting, Margaret met a woman named Joyce, who had successfully reunited with her daughter after decades apart. Joyce's journey hadn't been easy. Her daughter, too, had felt torn between her adoptive family and her birth mother. Yet, with time and patience, they had managed to build a relationship. Joyce's story gave Margaret hope. She learned that the journey was rarely straightforward, but that gentle persistence, combined with empathy for everyone involved, could make all the difference. Over the weeks, Margaret shared her own story, finding relief in releasing the emotions she had bottled up. She learned practical advice from the group: to remain open, to avoid pressuring Michael, and to allow him to come to her in his own time. The group taught her that her role now was to provide a safe, unconditional space for Michael, something he could rely on without feeling torn. One evening after a meeting, Joyce approached Margaret and handed her a small card. "This helped me and my daughter immensely," she said. The card held the contact information for a family counselor who specialized in reunification cases. "Maybe suggest this to Michael if he's open to it. Sometimes having someone guide you both through these emotions can really help." Margaret was hesitant, but she realized that the counselor might be a path forward, a way to support Michael's relationship with his adoptive parents while allowing them to explore their connection slowly and respectfully. That night, Margaret sent Michael a short message. "I know this is difficult for you, and I never want to hurt your bond with your parents. If it helps, I'd be open to meeting with a family counselor, someone who could help us navigate this together without any pressure. Whatever you decide, I'm here." Having put the decision in Michael's hands, Margaret felt a sense of calm. She realized that with the support of her new allies and the wisdom she had gained, she could move forward patiently, prepared to meet whatever came next with an open heart. In the days following her message to Michael, Margaret found herself bracing for whatever might come. Each day felt like a delicate balancing act between anticipation and acceptance, a preparation for any outcome. Her time in the support group had given her strength, but it had also deepened her awareness of the challenges that lay ahead. She knew she might still face rejection, yet she was determined to hold her ground, guided by love rather than fear. One morning, Margaret received a response from Michael. He expressed his gratitude for her understanding and shared that he had talked with his adoptive parents about the idea of family counseling. It hadn't been easy. His parents still harbored fears, but Michael reassured them of his love and respect for everything they had done for him. After a lot of discussion, they had agreed to support his journey, with the understanding that his relationship with Margaret wouldn't diminish his bond with. In his message, Michael wrote, "I think we're ready to take that next step, and I'd like to meet with the counselor you mentioned. I want us to move forward carefully, but I'm open to building something meaningful together." The relief that washed over Margaret was profound. She hadn't dared to hope for this level of acceptance, and yet here it was, a chance to slowly and carefully bridge the gap between them. With this new direction in place, Margaret scheduled the first session with the counselor, feeling a sense of purpose and focus she hadn't felt in years. In preparation for the session, Margaret spent hours reflecting on her journey, collecting memories and stories she hoped would help Michael understand who she was. She wanted to be open and vulnerable, to share the truth without sugarcoating or hiding anything. She understood that this was an opportunity to show her son her full self, flaws and all. Linda continued to be her confidant, helping her organize her thoughts and practice the words she wanted to say. "Be honest with him, Margaret," Linda advised. "He deserves to know the real you, and that includes all the love and sacrifices you've carried." The day of the counseling session arrived, and Margaret's heart raced with both nerves and excitement. When she arrived, Michael was already there, waiting. Seeing him in person again, her emotions surged, but she took a deep breath and steadied herself. They greeted each other with a hesitant but warm smile, acknowledging the moment's gravity. The counselor guided them through the session, helping them to explore their shared past and their hopes for the future. Margaret spoke about the circumstances that had led to the adoption, her dreams for his life, and the pain of parting with him. Michael, in turn, shared his own story, his curiosity about her, and the guilt he sometimes felt over reconnecting while still cherishing his adoptive parents. The honesty between them deepened, and Margaret could see how much care and integrity Michael possessed. By the end of the session, Margaret felt a profound sense of connection to her son, one that was no longer tangled in the secrecy and fear of the past. They agreed to continue meeting, to let their relationship grow naturally and openly. As they said their goodbyes, Margaret felt an inner strength she hadn't known before. She had faced the fears that had haunted her for years, and had found in Michael a reflection of her own resilience and kindness. She was ready now to embrace whatever challenges came next, knowing that together they could build something beautiful, one step at a time. Margaret and Michael continued meeting with the counselor over the following weeks, each session bringing them closer to understanding one another. Their discussions were honest, at times painfully so, revealing both the beautiful and difficult truths about their journey. Margaret found herself opening up in ways she never thought possible, sharing parts of her past that she had kept hidden even from herself. Michael, too, confided in her, sharing the complexities of his upbringing, his struggles with identity, and his appreciation for the life his adoptive parents had given him. But as their bond grew, Margaret sensed that an unspoken tension was building. One evening, as they sat in their familiar seats in the counselor's office, Michael finally voiced the question that had been weighing on him. "I need to know," he began, his voice strained but steady, "why you gave me up. I know you've told me before, but I think I need to hear it again. I need to understand." Margaret took a deep breath, her heart heavy with the gravity of his question. She looked into his eyes, seeing not just her son, but a man grappling with the deep, lingering wounds of his past. "I want you to know," she started, her voice gentle but clear, "that my decision was made from love. At the time, I was young, struggling, and alone. I had no family support, no stable job, and I wanted so desperately to give you a life filled with opportunities and security, things I didn't have." Tears filled her eyes as she continued, her voice wavering. "Letting you go broke my heart, Michael. There hasn't been a day that I haven't thought about you, wondered about your life, and prayed you were safe and loved. It was a choice I made because I believed it was best for you, even though it meant breaking my own heart." Michael listened, his expression intense yet unreadable. When she finished, a silence filled the room, heavy and charged. Then he spoke, his words measured and tinged with raw emotion. "I think I understand now, more than I did before, but it's still hard. I spent years wondering if I wasn't enough, or if I had been abandoned because of something lacking in me." Margaret's heart ached, and she reached across the small space between them, her hand finding his. "Michael, you were never unwanted. You were, and always will be, everything I could have dreamed of in a child. My decision had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with wanting you to have a life without hardship." As they held hands, the counselor allowed the moment to settle, respecting the weight of what had been shared. Michael's face softened, a glimmer of understanding and acceptance beginning to show. "Thank you for telling me," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I needed to hear that." In that shared silence, something shifted. The painful questions, the uncertainties, and the hurt from all those years began to give way to a profound, healing connection. For the first time, they were able to embrace not just as long-lost mother and son, but as two people who had journeyed through their own battles and had finally found each other. The session ended, but Margaret knew this was far from an end. Instead, it was the beginning of a true relationship with her son, a bond rooted in honesty, resilience, and love that could now flourish without the shadows of the past. Following that breakthrough session, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in decades. Her heart, which had carried the weight of loss, guilt, and yearning, now brimmed with a quiet but profound joy. The process with Michael hadn't been easy, nor was their relationship fully healed, but they had reached a place of understanding, a foundation upon which they could build something genuine. Michael began visiting Margaret outside of the counselor's office, bringing his young children to me. Margaret's heart soared when she saw her grandchildren for the first time, their wide, curious eyes and warm smiles rekindling a part of her soul. She marveled at their innocence, at how naturally they accepted her into their world, calling her Grandma with a sweetness that made her eyes well up each time. She took great care in creating small traditions with them, like baking cookies, telling bedtime stories, and sharing her garden, which had become a place of hope and renewal. As the weeks passed, Margaret could feel herself changing. The emptiness that had once filled her life was replaced by a profound gratitude. She no longer spent her days waiting, worrying, or questioning her worth. Her time with Michael and his family was full of laughter, storytelling, and quiet moments that held a powerful sense of belonging. She felt a deep connection to her roots, knowing her story was part of her son's legacy, and through him, her grandchildren's lives as well. One sunny afternoon, as she sat with Michael in her backyard, he turned to her, a reflective look in his eyes. "You know, this is exactly the kind of family connection I always wanted. It's hard to explain, but there's something different about knowing where I come from." His voice was filled with a gentle sincerity, a softness that touched Margaret's heart. "I can't thank you enough for finding me, for reaching out when you did." Margaret took his hand, her eyes filled with a love that was no longer tinged with regret, but only with pride. "Thank you for welcoming me," she replied. "You've given me more than you'll ever know." In that moment, Margaret realized how much she had changed. She had gone from a woman plagued by grief and loneliness to someone who had reclaimed her life, her identity, and her family. Her fears had been replaced by a quiet courage, her regrets by a deep satisfaction in the choices she'd made to rebuild her relationship with her son. Together, they watched the children play, their laughter echoing through the garden. Margaret felt that this, finally, was her victory. Not a dramatic, sweeping change, but the quiet triumph of a mother reunited with her child, surrounded by love and healing. Her heart was at peace, her life transformed, and she knew that from here forward, she could face the future with grace and gratitude. As Margaret settled into her role as Grandma, she began reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The days she spent with Michael and his family were filled with small but precious moments. Her grandchildren's bright laughter, Michael's stories about his life, and the simple joy of having a family to care for again. It was a warmth she had never expected to feel, especially after the painful years of isolation. Yet Margaret also recognized that her journey hadn't been without cost. Reconnecting with Michael had affected not only her life, but his as well. One evening, as they shared tea on her porch, Michael opened up about the complicated feelings he still held toward his adoptive parents. Though they'd cautiously accepted his desire to meet Margaret, he confessed that his relationship with them felt strained at times, as if there were now a quiet tension between his past and present. "Sometimes," he admitted softly, "I feel like I'm caught between two worlds. I love my adoptive parents. They're my family, and they gave me everything, but being here with you feels grounding. It's like a part of me I never understood before suddenly makes sense." Margaret listened, feeling both gratitude and an ache of sympathy. She understood that her presence in his life brought both clarity and complexity. "I'm sorry if my reaching out caused any strain," she said gently, reaching for his hand. "I never wanted to disrupt your world." Michael shook his head, a small smile on his face. "No, I needed this. Meeting you has filled a gap I didn't realize was there, but it's just a balancing act, you know." His eyes held a maturity and wisdom she admired, a reminder of the strong man he'd become. Margaret reflected on her own feelings of reconciliation and peace. She realized that reconnecting with Michael hadn't erased the pain of the past, nor had it made her earlier decisions any easier to bear. But it had brought healing in ways she hadn't anticipated, allowing her to view her life with a sense of closure and understanding. She had learned that family could exist in many forms and that love didn't diminish or replace. Rather, it expanded to make room for everyone. Their conversations often turned reflective, with Michael asking about her life, her youth, and her memories. Sharing her story with him allowed Margaret to see her past through a new lens, not one of loss and regret, but of resilience and the unbreakable bond between mother and child. She could tell that her story had a similar effect on Michael, helping him reconcile the pieces of his identity with pride and acceptance. Margaret knew that there would always be parts of her life marked by sorrow and sacrifice, but she had reached a place of contentment. In her reflections, she found that even the difficult choices, the lonely years, and the mistakes had led her to this moment of healing and reconciliation. As she watched Michael interact with his children, his love for them evident in every word and action, Margaret felt certain that her journey had come full circle. She was no longer just a mother in search of her son. She was part of a family, creating new memories and adding her own legacy to the lives of her grandchildren. The consequences of her journey had given her a deeper understanding of love's complexity and its boundless capacity to forgive, to grow, and to unite. In the weeks that followed, Margaret sensed that something was still unresolved between Michael and his adoptive parents. Though he had embraced their growing bond, she could see the weight of loyalty and lingering guilt in his eyes. It was clear that he cared deeply for them, and Margaret felt it was time to help him reconcile this delicate balance. One evening, as they shared a quiet moment in her kitchen, she gently brought it up. "Michael, I can see that this journey has been challenging for you. I know how much you love your parents, and I want you to know that loving me doesn't mean you have to love them any less. They're as much a part of you as I am." Michael looked down, his face shadowed with conflicted emotions. "I know, Margaret, I feel like I owe them everything, and now that you're here, I feel pulled in two directions. They gave me a home, they raised me, and yet meeting you has filled a piece of me I didn't even know was missing." Margaret reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his. "What they did for you was extraordinary, Michael. They loved you as their own, and that love doesn't change just because we found each other. Maybe it would help if you invited them here. I'd love to meet them, to thank them for everything they did for you." Michael seemed surprised, but he also looked relieved. After a few moments he nodded, a soft smile breaking through his hesitation. "I think that might be what we all need. Thank you, Margaret." A week later, Michael's adoptive parents, Richard and Helen, arrived at Margaret's house. Margaret felt a surge of nervousness, wondering how they would perceive her. When they stepped inside, she was greeted by Helen's cautious yet warm smile and Richard's protective gaze. She felt their love for Michael immediately, an invisible bond that filled the room. Margaret took a deep breath and extended her hand. "Thank you for raising him. Thank you for giving him the love and life I couldn't at the time." Her words were heartfelt, and she hoped they conveyed her respect and gratitude. Helen's eyes softened, and after a brief hesitation, she stepped forward to hug Margaret. "We always knew he had a mother out there who loved him," she whispered, "and now, seeing the man he's become, I think we understand why he needed this connection with you." The four of them spent hours talking, bridging the gaps with stories and memories. Margaret shared her own life's journey, her hardships, and her admiration for the strong, caring man that Michael had become under their care. Richard and Helen, in turn, opened up about their journey as adoptive parents, their hopes, fears, and the challenges they faced raising an adopted child. By the end of the evening, Margaret felt an unexpected sense of unity with them. They were three parents who had loved Michael in their own ways, and instead of competing for his love, they recognized that he was a richer, more complete person because of all of them. For the first time, Margaret felt a true sense of closure. She had reconnected with her son, embraced her role as a grandmother, and reconciled with the family that had raised Michael. She was at peace, knowing that her presence had added to his life without taking anything away from those who had loved him first. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret's life settled into a rhythm she had never imagined, one that was rich with love, acceptance, and peace. She continued to spend time with Michael and his family, cherishing the small moments, her grandchildren's laughter as they played in her garden, Michael's stories about his work, and even the warm occasional visits from his adoptive parents, Richard and Helen. Their shared understanding had allowed them all to create a harmonious, extended family, rooted in compassion and mutual respect. One afternoon, as Margaret sat on her porch watching her grandchildren play, she reflected on the incredible Jay. She thought of the years of loneliness, the decades spent wondering about the child she had let go, and the courage it had taken to reach out and find him again. It was a journey marked by pain, resilience, and unexpected joy, a journey that had tested her heart and brought her closer to herself. Linda joined her on the porch, watching the children with a smile. "You've come so far, Margaret," she said softly. "I remember when you first started this search, you were so afraid of what you might find." Margaret nodded, her gaze warm and reflective. "I was afraid of being rejected, of stirring up painful memories, but I've learned that sometimes the hardest journeys lead us exactly where we're meant to be." She looked at her family, a serene contentment settling over her. "I've realized that love has a way of growing, expanding, and filling the spaces we thought were empty forever. I have my son, my grandchildren, and the family I never thought I'd have." As the evening sun cast a warm glow over her home, Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the family surrounding her, but for the strength she had found within herself. Her journey had taught her that love is not bound by blood alone. It is nurtured by kindness, sacrifice, and the willingness to let go and forgive. Margaret had come to understand that family could be built in many ways, and that the connections they created were stronger for the trials they had endured together. In that moment, Margaret felt whole. She had lived through loss, isolation, and fear, only to discover a life filled with new beginnings, forgiveness, and an unbreakable bond with her son. Her heart, once scarred by the pain of separation, was now healed and open, filled with an enduring love that embraced both the past and the future. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Margaret gathered her grandchildren close, wrapping them in her arms. She knew that life would continue to present challenges and heartaches, but she also knew that she had found the strength to face them. Her journey was a testament to resilience, the power of forgiveness, and the joy of unexpected reunion. And as she looked into her grandchildren's eyes, she felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that her legacy would carry forward in the love she had fought so hard to reclaim. Margaret's story was one of redemption and renewal, a reminder that life, no matter how broken it may seem, can always find a way to heal, grow, and blossom in unexpected ways. With her family by her side, she faced the future with a heart full of love and a spirit renewed, ready to embrace whatever came next.